All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we head west for a closer look through our restorative lens of restorative justice, our regional lens of restorative justice. We're in for a treat with practitioners and system actors from the West Coast sharing insights and strategies from their work in the field. So my name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns, and I serve as Assistant Director for the National Center on Restorative Justice. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our partners and collaborators who help make events like this possible. So special thanks to Vermont Law and Graduate School and our additional grant partners and colleagues at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont. And also special thanks to our federal funding partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, who are a part of the United States Office of Justice Programs. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator today, Kathleen McGoy, a skilled trainer and facilitator in restorative justice practices and conflict transformation. Formerly the executive director of Longmont Community Justice Partnership in Colorado, Kathleen led community restorative justice programs with police and schools for 8 years. She's also the co-author of the Little Book of Restorative Teaching Tools for Online Learning, released just this fall. Kathleen, thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to you and get us started for today.
Thanks so much for the intro, Avery. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name's Kathleen McGoy. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm so honored to be moderating this panel of restorative justice practitioners and learning more through their wisdom with you all. I wanted to remind you that during this webinar, we're not utilizing the chat, but we do ask that you engage with the panelists through the Q&A feature. Please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A, and we will make time at the end for the panelists to answer. I also want to point out this amazing RJ map that's recently been developed through a collaboration between the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, NACRJ, and the National Center on Restorative Justice. This map provides a very helpful directory to identify and connect restorative justice practitioners and entities across the United States. So if you haven't yet, please submit entries to be included on the map and directory by visiting nacrj.org. And I see that Avery just linked to the map in the chat, so you can follow that link and enter your information to really add to this network. So I'd love to shift now to introducing our panelists with an opening question. And I think I need to, Avery, will you pause the screen share? Great, wonderful. So I'd love to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, sharing your name, a few lines to help us understand where you are and where and how you're practicing restorative justice, and then a connection question to help us know how you're arriving in this space. Right now, if you were any form of transportation, what would you be, and how full is your tank? And I'll pass it to Connor to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to fellow panelists and folks attending today. Just really grateful for your time and to be a part of this and with such awesome folks, and looking forward to the learning today. Yeah, so as Kathleen said, my name is Connor Novotny. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Restorative Justice Program Manager at the University of Wyoming here in Laramie, Wyoming. University of Wyoming is the only four-year institution in the state of Wyoming, so a lot of our students from across the whole state end up coming to the University of Wyoming. So it's a pretty unique environment, and a lot of folks' first exposure to restorative justice. I was telling folks on the panel earlier that yeah, we're the least populated state, and this might be, as far as I'm aware, after having done some research and trying to connect with folks, we're like the only RJ program in the state of Wyoming. And so that's a unique sort of feature of this part of the West. It's very sparsely populated, and there's not a ton of resources. And so every resource that we have here counts for multiple roles and multiple resources out here in this environment. My first training, I'm excited that Kathleen is here because was through the Longmont Community Justice Partnership, who again, in this, I think, a pretty Western fashion, brought training up to my hometown of Casper, Wyoming, where I was learning about restorative justice practices and working as a volunteer through that org. And then my experience basically is that I'm really strongly connected to the University of Wyoming through my education, but then also working here as an instructor. And I've had the opportunity to build and develop this restorative justice program where there was no things really like it before. So it's been an interesting, unique part of that journey that I'm excited to share with folks today. We're going on, this is our 4th year of having the program so far. So I'm just really grateful for the work that we do and just, again, for being a part of this panel today. The question was, what is our vehicle that we're driving today? Okay. It's snowing in Laramie. It's snowing on the Front Range, and I'm driving a sled today. And the question was, how much fuel do you have? There's no fuel, but there's a lot of gravity that's pulling me down that hill. So I feel like I'm in motion. Things are good. It's beautiful outside, but also when you're sledding, you're getting hit in the face with like snowflakes. You're like, is this fun? Is this exciting? Is this scary? And yes, it's all of the above. So that's kind of where I'm at today and have been with the semester so far. So yeah, I think that's a little bit about me. And I believe I'll pass to Tristan, I think was next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Tristan Edwards. I am a public defender in Portland, Oregon. My title at Metropolitan Public Defender is the lead attorney for restorative justice. And basically in that role, I do some public defense work, so I handle a smaller major felony caseload. And I also work on policy issues related to promoting the use of restorative justice as an alternative to prosecution. That work brings me into legislative spaces, into other policy spaces, but it also allows me to work directly with community-based organizations that are doing the work. So I'm personally not a practitioner of restorative justice. I get to be a cheerleader for that work and try to elevate it as best as I can. In terms of my mode of transportation, I would say that I am a canoe, kind of flying down the river. It is a very rocky river. There are a lot of rapids. I don't have any fuel, but I'm just going in whatever direction the river takes me and trying my best to keep everybody in the boat, pull people into the boat when necessary, and just hang on for the ride and adapt. And I am so sorry, I don't remember who I'm passing it to.
We'll hear from Damaris next, please.
All right, thanks. Greetings, everyone. I'm Damaris Evans, and I am a senior assistant district attorney with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. I'm calling in from Oakland, California, and I, in the district attorney's office, I'm the head of the Civil Rights Bureau. So there's a number of different units in the Civil Rights Bureau. Restorative Justice is one of them. So working on expanding the implementation of restorative justice and the district attorney's office. There's been programming that has been happening in the juvenile division in connection with a partnership with Community Works West. We've also implemented a lot more referrals to restorative justice programs in post-conviction unit, which is one of the units in the Civil Rights Bureau, and utilizing victim offender dialogues or referring folks to victim offender dialogues who are survivors involved in a bunch of the resentencing cases that we handle. For transportation, if I were a transport vehicle, I'm thinking electric train, maybe like high-speed electric train. And so I wouldn't have any fuel, but I would say my battery is full. And I'll pass it to Sandra.
Thank you, Damaris. Hello, everybody. It's great to be on the call today. My name is Sandra Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Healing Pathways at the Ahimsa Collective. And we are based out of Oakland, California. And Healing Pathways is essentially our organization's collection of restorative justice programs and offerings, and those include a victim offender dialogue program. So we work closely with CDCR in California and are in different prisons holding those dialogues with incarcerated folks and the survivors of harm that wish to meet with them. And then we also have 3 different healing and accountability programs that take place in prisons as well: Realize, Empathize, and the PATH program, which is focused on supporting folks writing letters of accountability to be submitted into the Accountability Letter Bank in California. And then we also have a Restorative Justice and Community program, which is a program that receives referrals not from system actors, but directly from community. And finally, we have survivor and support engagement at our organization, where we work with survivors of harm in a variety of different ways. We offer one-on-one therapy to folks, as well as groups, retreats, so on and so forth. And yeah, I'm just, again, really happy to be here. And because it's October 30th, I would say that my mode of transportation would be that I would turn into a vampire bat and fly away. And again, since it's the day before Halloween, my tank is probably quite full. And with that, I will pass it over to Javier.
Hello, everybody. My name is Javier Starring, and I am with Healing Dialogue in Action. It's a nonprofit organization based out of Los Angeles. And I think we're the only organization that accompanies person responsible for the harm, their families, as well as victims and survivors of harm. And we have programs in 7 different prisons in California, where we offer restorative justice classes and victim impact classes. We are also in the juvenile facilities in LA County full time. So my colleagues spend 8 hours a day, 7 days a week inside juvenile facilities, also facilitating these classes, but mostly just accompanying, building relationships with the people who are incarcerated. The real gift of Healing Dialogue in Action is right now we have 31 staff. Out of those 31, only myself and one other person were not sentenced to life in prison and or had a loved one murdered. So all of my colleagues, we refer to ourselves as wounded healers, are people who have experienced the worst that this system has given on both sides, if we want to talk about sides, right? And somehow found a healing path that they committed to and developed unique gifts, unique passion to do this work. So I'm blessed to I've had the opportunity to do this work over 35 years now. And on Monday, I did a victim offender dialogue at Avenal Prison, where the mother of the victim met the man that killed her son. And these experiences are just so profound, so transforming, that I feel so blessed to have these opportunities in my life. I would be a Volkswagen bus, just because I see myself like that, like a comfortable little Volkswagen bus, and I'm like 3/4 full, traveling from prison to prison.
Thanks, Javier, and thanks everybody for helping us to orient to your background. As you've heard, we have quite a variety of backgrounds and contexts and skills in this group, in this panel. So yeah, looking forward to the dialogue. Just for further introduction of myself, Kathleen McGoy, she, her pronouns. I'm based in Longmont, Colorado, but most of my work now happens all over the country, providing facilitation, training, and consultation with restorative justice programs, but even more so, groups and organizations, companies that want to incorporate restorative practices into their workplace environment or community environment. So my focus has shifted a bit towards taking restorative values and practices and expanding how they can be used beyond schools and the justice system. And I actually just facilitated a dialogue this morning. And so I'm feeling like my mode of transportation is a bicycle going downhill, because I think it was an impactful experience for all the participants. And yeah, I've got more energy coming out of that dialogue. So I'd like to expand now and hear a little more from each panelist. If you could talk a little bit about some of the key successes from the program that you're connected with, or the RJ implementation that you've worked on. What are, say, 2 or 3 key successes, and what strategies have been most effective in advancing restorative justice in your region? Key successes and effective strategies. Connor, would you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Yes, I'm grateful every day that we have a program that's been going on for this long here at the University of Wyoming. So one of the successes I feel is really that we're here, you know, and 4 years at the University of Wyoming can feel like a long time, just with how quickly things change in higher ed and stuff like that. So it's been a really cool process to, and yes, I'm just very grateful for, to see the program grow, right? So we started with a core group of us that were training was brought in by our Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion from University of Michigan to sort of train folks about restorative justice practices here. And there was like the intention set, and that was like several years ago, right? And they were like, we want to bring restorative practices here. And we're like, okay, cool. We got the training. Now what, right? We have a lot of good ideas. And then what do we do? Which I'm sure is pretty common to a lot of folks' journeys, right? Especially working in the institutional context. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that the Dean of Students, Ryan O'Neill, opened up a position and said, we want to make this a spot. We want to give this a home, and we want to build an RJ thing. And just so grateful that I was able to get into that role, because it's been kind of like, Connor, you know the material. And I'm like, I only know so much. And and I was lucky enough to be trained in the University of San Diego program as well. But right, when you're doing this work, it's always like, oh, I'm so passionate and believe in it so deeply. And how do I get better at it? How do I do it faithfully? How do I do it more restoratively? So I've had a lot of great experiences working with mentors and colleagues, and also trust from the institution to say, you're going to figure this out, and we're going to help you figure it out, and we're going to grow. And so the approach for us has always been, what can I throw against the wall and see what sticks, right? And I think in that approach is, you found the other people that are going to be passionate about the work, right? And so it always has been, the main people I want to serve here as students, get them passionate and excited, because when students are passionate and excited about things, right, then they're gonna use their voices and show up for things and make a huge difference. And so one of our big successes is I think just the amount of student involvement. We started facilitating some circle keeper training. That is something we hold every semester, and it's open to students, staff, faculty, but also the community of Laramie, because we want to strengthen those relationships for everybody across all those bounds. And that's just been a really cool program to see grow. And reason why I want to share that is we have seen people with that training, and then with support and some implementation, being able to carry those circles into meaningful ways in their own community, right? So we say, here's the skills, and we're all going to learn all this together, and we're going to keep learning this through ongoing workshops. But what do you want to do in order to continue this work, right? Do you want us to help start a circle for you? Do you just want to design a circle and have some prompts? Do you want us to facilitate for you? We're always just trying to meet people where they're at with their comfortability with restorative practices and be available for them. One example, which is a sad one, but I'm glad we have this tool, was here in Wyoming in 2022. We had a group of students who were wanting to respond after the Club Q shooting in Colorado Springs. A lot of our students are from Coloradoans, were deeply, deeply impacted by what had taken place. And so one of our great connectors on campus was the Queer Community Coalition, a student org who were really passionate about this work. And many of the, like the chapter president, folks like that, had received RJ training through our program. And they reached out to me and they said, Connor, we really want to do the circle. We want to have a grief and processing circle. Can you help us? And I said, okay, of course. Like, what help do you need? And they said, well, you just look over our prompts. We feel comfortable with facilitating. We feel comfortable with organizing. This is a part of one of our bigger events, but we know this is what our community needs. And then they also asked if I could join as a participant, right? Just to sit in a circle with them. And so an example of how these restorative practices can be transformative, especially in this university setting, right? Where we say, here's the tools, let's develop them together, and then you can use them as you need to support your communities as needed. And so examples like that are ones that really stick out to me. Other than that, we've been able to, a little bit slower on this, but we've been able to start our criminal diversion program. So we're working with just the county right now. We can get students referred to the RJ program as an alternative sentencing. We're working on our city partners to try and continue to expand that work. So I kind of set myself this trap that I'm in of just, again, throwing that up against everything against the wall, just trying to be excited and passionate and share that passion with people. And now I have too much work. And now it's time for the program to expand, right? And which is a good thing if it feels a little strenuous right now. So I think the strategies in my region is just because it is new, like so much of what we do is collaborative educational pieces. So I'm just trying to say, what is your org? I had a training with like Laramie Business Council, right? And I said, why do you want to learn about restorative justice? And how can I show you what I know and connect it to the worlds that make sense to you so that you know what we're doing and can help us from a community perspective support and bolster this work. Laramie's small, it's a town of about 30,000. And I think like 10,000 of those are students. Graduate and undergraduate students. And so every little piece has a huge impact, not just for our campus community, but the spaces outside of that. The last piece I'll say before passing it on is that we have the complicated history of being a land grant institution at the University of Wyoming, which part of that means that our mission is to serve also the state of Wyoming as people. And so there's always been this lens for our program about how can we not just serve our students, but serve our community, which is the state of Wyoming, because we're the only four-year institution, and having a place to learn and grow and be grounded in expansion of these RJ practices. But in order to do that, I think I need a few more staff members to help with that work. So we'll keep you posted on that. But that's some of our success, a little bit about our journey. But yeah, it's been a great ride so far. So I won't take any more time and pass to Tristan.
Great, thanks for the pass, Connor. I guess one thing I'll talk about first is kind of one of the key strategies that we've had in developing restorative justice here in Oregon. And I'm a public defender. My focus is on restorative justice within the criminal space, whether that is through kind of, more traditional diversion programs or trying to intercept entry into the criminal system. So one of the kind of big pieces of legislation that happened within the restorative justice community in 2021 was the passage of the Restorative Justice Grant Program. This obviously came at a time when there was a strong appetite for criminal justice reform and adjacent types of policy. And so I had been a member of a committee that was run through the governor's office called the Racial Justice Council, which was tasked with proposing legislation aimed at trying to create a more equitable Oregon. And my committee specifically focused on criminal justice reform. And so some of the conversations that we had were around, what reforms do we want to see to the system, but also how do we acknowledge that our system has in so many ways, these really strong foundations in racism, and what does it mean to answer the question of what is the alternative? What can we be doing and building up as an alternative response to harm in society? And so restorative justice just seemed like a really easy and natural fit. We made the proposal and we were lucky to have that passed during the 2021 legislative session, and the state allocated $4 million for a 2-year period to this grant program. Now, of course, we have always been in a state now of keeping that fund alive and making sure that the state is continuing to appropriate dollars to the fund. But the fund ultimately created 7 different programs that are across the state of Oregon. And when speaking about kind of strategies, I think, trying to achieve state funding is a strategy. It's what has worked in Oregon. It's not necessarily the path, or it certainly isn't the only path, not necessarily the best path for every state in terms of trying to get those dollars that you need in order to build up these programs. But it's something that's been able to work in Oregon, and it's really exciting to see it grow, and also to see the legislature become just more educated and excited about restorative justice. Another strategy that I think has been incredibly effective in just advancing the entire effort has just been collaboration. The Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon is a volunteer-run nonprofit that seeks to convene all of the programs across the state. And when the Restorative Justice Grant Program came into existence, and we had these 7 grantees pop up, the Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon stepped in to really facilitate that collaboration. So we have monthly cohort meetings where all of the programs come together and talk about different issues, workshop cases sometimes, help each other troubleshoot, learn different lessons, and provide, share training resources as well. And that collaboration has also been really important to continuing to advocate at the legislative level, both for funding and for confidentiality. Outside of kind of that statewide kind of broader lens, the community-based organization that I work closest with is called the Restorative Roots Project. The Restorative Roots Project is a community-based nonprofit in Portland, Oregon. They had the benefit of collaborating with Equal Justice USA's Restorative Justice Project, and shout out to Sandra, who was early on the team helping us with training and technical assistance. Her and her team were so amazing, and really set us up to not only be trained in a model of restorative justice that is driven by data and has been shown to be effective, specifically in addressing serious and violent crime, but also giving the Restorative Roots Project the tools to develop their own nonprofit and to really build out the community-based organization to be as restorative as possible and to have longevity. There are so many things that I could say in terms of strategies and terms of challenges. But I think one thing that is a lesson that I have learned out of this program, and I guess I should mention that the original program that the Restorative Roots Project piloted was a collaboration with the District Attorney's Office here in Multnomah County. That is an ongoing collaboration, but we have learned from other programs across the state, from our own experience, that having a single referral source can be troubling. It can be a problem because you're relying on one entity to provide referrals, to provide cases, and there are a variety of different things that can impact the number of referrals that go through. And especially when it comes to district attorney's offices, there are elections, there are changes in the political will and kind of the mission of the office. We're going through one of those changes now. It's not clear if it will affect the functioning of the restorative justice program, but it made it clear to us that we needed to increase our referral streams and kind of diversify so that if one goes down, we could rely more heavily on another. And that has led to an approach of really rooting in community and trying to do more community connectedness in order to receive community referrals. That's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on during this presentation. But the main thing that I wanted to say right now, just in terms of strategies, is I believe that getting rooted in community will also help when it comes to collaborating with system partners. And, having the system partner diversion has been really awesome in terms of being able to demonstrate the success of this program. Even though our referrals are less than what we would want to see them as, the Restorative Roots Project is handling some of the highest level crimes that are entering the system, and they are showing success, and it's really amazing to see. It's particularly amazing from the lens of a public defender, where I work with this client population and see the challenges that they have with engaging with the criminal system, and then to watch the way that things can really shift when there is a non-punitive relational approach that is put into play to try and engage and work with people on getting to that point of accountability. It's really just been so awesome to see, and I think that collaboration with the district attorney's office office allowed us to show that success. But I'm now also of the mind that really rooting in the community and showing the community that restorative justice can work is going to have, multitude of benefits, including, diversifying our referral stream, but also hopefully helping us gain even more credibility with the district attorney's office, so that we have champions in the community who can support the program, and we can have more opportunities to demonstrate that this works. And I will pass it on to Damaris.
Thank you. So I'll talk about strategies first, and just to provide some context. Before being here in Alameda County District Attorney's Office, I was in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and working in their restorative justice programming. And so although that ended up being interrupted a bit, I think I want to reference some of the strategies that started in that office and the work that I was doing, because I think that it was going in a direction that seemed to be very successful. And one of those was coalition building, partnerships, relationship building, and strategic planning. There was a restorative justice collaborative that brought together, similar to what Tristan described. However, this included folks from the district attorney's office, some of the community-based organizations. One of the organizations that Sandra was in was a part of that collaborative, and other facilitator groups, as well as other government organizations, and also community members, individuals. So bringing all of those individuals together to help try to create a restorative justice sort of infrastructure within the community, and to have some buy-in and a way to have community involved in the process that wouldn't have all of the sort of power in that dynamic just with the district attorney's office. And that included a lot of relationship building, which took time. It was building relationships over a period of, 18 months to 2 years of trying to, having folks that are really committed to this process, and then strategic planning and having everyone's voice be involved in what is the direction that we want to have this go in. And even though, as Tristan mentioned, sometimes with the different, political objectives or missions from different offices involved, I think that the relationships that happen during that process are still, you can't undo that. So there are relationships that I built with individuals in that process that have survived all of the sort of interruption that came as a result of some of the politics. And fortunately, there's an opportunity to continue that work in Alameda County as well, and to try to build a coalition and partnerships, and to use strategic planning here as well to replicate that model. And the point is, again, is to try to embed some of the decision-making, some of the commitment to restorative justice in the community, so that so much of it doesn't live within the district attorney's office. So that's one thing in terms of strategies. And the other is really victim engagement, and being able to really engage with survivors and victims from a lens of restorative justice, to help them to understand that restorative justice is not just something that is there to benefit the person that caused harm, which a lot of people hear this sort of narrative in the general mainstream, that it's really there for, people who were charged with a crime, not so much for the survivor. So to be able to develop those relationships and engage with individuals, so that they understand that this is something that's geared towards, or can be geared towards and designed to assist with their healing as well. And one of the, there's a bunch of, well, I'll mention a few successes. One of them is that the restorative justice programming in Alameda County district attorney's office dates back to 2012 and was one of the first counties to implement restorative community conferencing with Community Works West. And although that program has had ups and downs and ebbs and flows, and when I came to the office, the referrals to Community Works West was minimal, just maybe less than a dozen referrals. And so, but the fact that it has still continued for this amount of time is impressive. And I actually saw this information in the Equal Justice USA toolkit that references, Community Works West, and the Alameda County District Attorney's Office is one of the partners that Equal Justice USA is working with. So to be able to have that longevity, even with the ups and downs that the program has struggled through, and have it be available for potential replication for any other organizations or offices that want to also engage in restorative justice, I think is very, would count as a success. The other one I want to point to does have to do with a individual case. And this is a case that's pending, so I can't really go into the details, and I will describe it as a success just because, in this capacity, getting to talk to victims, as I mentioned earlier, heading the post-conviction unit and doing a lot of resentencing, oftentimes it's cases where, it's been the most, the worst harm that you can imagine, often homicide cases, and just some of the worst harms that anyone could imagine living through. And so oftentimes survivors, 20, 30 years later are still very much impacted by the harm that they have suffered from. And this one individual case, and oftentimes they don't want to have anything to do with the individual. Sometimes they want the person to, just die in jail, or sometimes even, they want capital case, sentences to remain in place. And so, people are on all different ends of the spectrum in terms of, where they are and their healing and processing of the trauma. And this one individual case, it was a woman who, had survived one of the most horrific crimes that you can imagine, with loved ones being killed. And she was just very interested. I mean, she actually even asked me about what was available to help her, and just talked about how she's trying to, continue to, live with the pain that she's endured. And this was a crime that happened over around 30 years ago. And so, someone who's a little bit up in age now, but just a very, very sweet, loving person, still trying to, do well with the harm that she engaged in. And, I shared with her about the victim offender dialogues, and, was something that, after all this time, she still really hadn't really heard about, or didn't hear about it in the way that I was sharing about it. And she was so interested, and was like, I have some questions for the individual, and, we have a resentencing coming up, and she wanted to know, would she be able to ask those questions before the resentencing? And I was like, I don't think it's going to happen quite that soon. Victim offender dialogues can sometimes take time, but just the fact that she was really interested in asking questions of this individual that had caused so much harm to her, and again, unimaginable. And so that process is being handled by one of our community-based facilitators that engage in victim offender dialogues. But just seeing someone who's really interested in engaging in that process, and seeing how that could possibly be healing and helpful for them, provides so much hope that this is something that other folks will also be interested in. And so with that, I will pass it on to Sandra.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really great to hear others share on successes and strategy. And I feel like there's a lot that I would ultimately echo, especially from what Tristan and Demaris said, because I completely agree that community building and focusing on relationship is such an important strategy and inherent to restorative justice. And I think that strategically, it's also a way to kind of weather the storms of political changes. And that does include, in many ways, a diversification of referral streams, which I think is also a strategy that's so important. So I'll speak a little bit on that from the perspective of the Ahimsa Collective. And you know, one of the programs that I'd like to focus on in this response is the Restorative Justice and Community program that we have, because that came to be in a very organic way. The RJC program started during the pandemic when so much of the work we were doing was really affected by the shutdowns. You know, we weren't able to go into the prisons, and so that turned to correspondence between facilitators and folks that were incarcerated. Dialogues, of course, we weren't able to go inside to hold dialogues, and so they switched over to being held on Zoom. But the RJC really came out of a lot of interest in accessing restorative processes without having to go through system agencies or institutions, but rather directly to an organization. And it really came out of word of mouth too. So one thing that I'll say about our work that I didn't mention earlier is that a lot of our restorative justice work is focused on addressing sexual harm specifically. And so even in the RJC, where we were essentially receiving calls and emails from folks all over the country, even there we saw a stronger lean towards sexual harm. So I think as far as the successes go, there's several. We've had a lot of really successful processes, and you know, saw a lot of healing and deep impact in survivors and people that caused harm. But being able to do that without the context of, you know, touch points with the criminal legal system, I think is really significant. I think it's incredible to see folks in community tap into their own power and their own agency and say, I want to address a harm, I want to explore this, but I don't necessarily want to go through traditional avenues. And the way that the word spread about this program, I think, also speaks a lot to those earlier points around strategy with community building and relationship. It's really folks saying, I had this experience, this is who, you know, who I worked with, so on and so forth. And so it's been a very organic and emergent program. And then the other thing that I'll say about strategy is that we are also a founding member of the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition. And so I think strategically, and there's a little bit of RJ, especially in the Bay Area, kind of historically baked into this, is that we really tried not to focus solely on program development, but also on community organizing and advocacy, and essentially like working towards creating the conditions where restorative justice can actually thrive and be deeply rooted. And so I think that combination is very, very important, not just in getting programs up and running, but in creating sustainability and health around those programs and longevity. Is essentially we are eventually and most likely always going to have to go fight for these programs, fight for restorative justice. What does it mean to have a base around that, to be organized, to have an agenda essentially, so that when the time comes to advocate and to fight for our work, we're equipped and we're able to do so. And I can speak more on the coalition down the line, but I will pass it over to Javier.
Hi, thanks. You know, I was just thinking and feeling grateful, you know, that we have such insightful, passionate people in this movement, because I've been around longer than all of you, I think. And so much of my time was just explaining to people what restorative justice was. You know, when I would hand them my business card and they're like, restorative justice, what is that? So I wanted to bring some context to that, you know, along with all the frustrations and the struggles of trying to do restorative justice work within a system that prioritizes punishment many times, we've come a long way. We've come a real long way. When Healing Dialogue in Action, when we started going into prisons, there was no funding for programs coming into prisons, right? So we were doing it out of raising our own funds to do that. And something very significant that brought money specifically to restorative justice really was a fortunate, event where it was in 2018, I got a call from Van Jones, who I'd known. Van Jones from CNN. He started when he came out of school. He started a nonprofit in Oakland, and I was working as a chaplain at juvenile hall. So he came and spent some time with me in LA, and we stayed in communication. And in 2018, he called me up and he said, "Are you doing any victim offender dialogues on homicides?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm doing one right now." And so he brought his cameras down. His idea was to just film one victim offender dialogue for a show that he had on CNN back then. But he was so moved by it that he went back and pitched it as a series. CNN eventually aired a series in 2019 called The Redemption Project that it showed 8 different victim offender dialogues. 2 of them I facilitated. And from that, in 2020, the governor, CDCR, the Department of Corrections, the department that runs the prisons out here, they presented victim offender dialogue as, where CDCR wanted to invest, prioritize. And they pitched it to the governor, and the governor allocated $2 million specifically for restorative justice programs in prison. But I would say that the biggest success for me is coming to the realization that the model that we've created at Healing Dialogue in Action is worthy of analyzing and considering. And I mentioned it at the introduction, right? That the facilitators, the people that are doing the work of accompaniment, are people who have the same lived experience, similar lived experiences to the people that they're accompanying. But not just the lived experience, it's more how they internalize their healing journey, how it became a part of them. And right now, we are working with UCLA and another national organization to study specifically that, right? That what is different when the people that are doing this work connect at such deep level. So I would mention that as a success in the movement.
Thanks, Javier, and thanks all for sharing some of those key successes and strategies. Our next question is about the impact of restorative justice legislation and statutes on your work. And I wanted to take a moment here to mention the Restorative Justice Laws database that's available through the National Center. And I think Avery will share that link, but that's an amazing resource and tool where you can search key topics and find out what restorative justice statutes exist throughout the country regarding those topics, or find out more about what's happening in each state. So the overarching question, and I have here that we would have myself, Sandra, Damaris, and Connor speak to this, is, in your experience, what impact have legislative statutes had on your work? I'm going to share a few thoughts from the Colorado experience, and then I'll pass to Damaris and Sandra to share about California. A question came in the Q&A specifically for our California panelists, so I'll just mention that too before I pass to you. In Colorado, between 2007 and 2018, the Colorado legislature enacted 44 statutes that contribute to the growing legal infrastructure for restorative justice. And I wanted to just share briefly 3 of the main outcomes of that legislation and 3 of the areas where it's fallen short of what we had envisioned and hoped for. So 3 primary outcomes are, one, that the legislation increased funding and awareness for restorative justice, which we all know is really important. 2, the legislation brought more legitimacy to restorative justice programs and created more opportunities for those who've experienced harm, caused harm, or system actors to request restorative justice. So the overall ability to ask for restorative justice as a process increased. And then 3rd, the legislation has created statewide networks and initiatives. So we have, for example, a state restorative justice coordinating council in Colorado with seats that are allocated to both systems and community-based partners. On the other hand, where some of the legislation has fallen short, one, it's great to have the legislation, but how it's actually implemented or enacted can be inconsistent. So, for example, not all harm parties or victims are being informed of restorative justice at this point, even though our Victim Rights Act requires prosecutors to do that, to provide that information. In some cases, legislation limits the use of restorative justice, like in cases of domestic violence and sexual harm. And 3rd, there are some inherent tensions within the legislation. For example, the fund that's been made available to support RJ programming is actually generated by a court fee paid by defendants, which we know has a disproportionate impact on people of color. So that's just one tension. We know that others exist. I'll pause there. I do have an article to share that's very informative about evaluation of those aspirations and visions for Colorado's RJ legislation and how it's actually played out and impacted the field. We'll provide that link to you. I'd love to hear from our folks from California and just to name out loud the specific questions that have come in regarding legislation. One is, has anyone worked on any pretrial adult felony cases? And if so, how do you navigate the lack of legislation regarding communication between victim offender dialogue participants? And then also for California, is there any upcoming legislation to support more adult felony restorative justice and victim offender dialogue cases in the pretrial moment or otherwise? So Sandra or Damaris, would you be willing to take the lead on those questions?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that a bit. So firstly, just to separate out the victim offender dialogue context from pretrial adult felony cases. So victim offender dialogue processes are ones that happen pretty exclusively, to my knowledge, in CDCR for folks who have already been convicted and have been sentenced to CDCR. So victim offender dialogues are sort of per se post-conviction processes where the person who was convicted and sentenced that caused harm is able to engage in a dialogue only in cases where the victim or survivor specifically requests to engage in a victim offender dialogue. So there's not, I don't believe there's a process right now that I'm aware of where the person who caused harm can request the dialogue, and that request can be communicated to the survivor. It has to be survivor initiated at this time. And so those are all post-conviction processes. But I have been involved in pretrial adult felony cases, which are more similar to the restorative community conferencing model that Community Works West engages in through in San Francisco is the Make It Right program. Here in Alameda County, they don't have a specific name for it. They're just referred to as restorative community conferencing. And in that context, this question is specifically for adults, but it has historically happened in both counties with juvenile referrals. In San Francisco, it was extended to involve transitional age youth as the sort of priority category. And ultimately, the goal was to have it available for any survivors who wanted to have restorative justice as a part of their case. And so that can happen after. So pre-trial, the preference is that it happen not only pre-trial, but also pre-charging. So before any charging document is filed, the case is referred to restorative justice programming. And at that point, the community-based partner engages in preparation, contacts both the person who caused harm and the survivor, prepares for the dialogue through the conference, and then also basically handles all aspects of the case, including the actual conference, any agreements that come out of it, and monitoring those agreements to make sure that there's compliance. So that's like the most common form of pre-trial adult felony cases. And in terms of the communication between the individuals, it's sort of turned over again to the community-based organization to prepare all parties so that it is a healing space, so there's not additional trauma that happens through that process. There's also pretty strong confidentiality agreements that are signed by all of the stakeholders, so that any communications that happen in the conference are not to be used in any subsequent prosecution or litigation. So lawyers are not present for the most part, and in most cases, and I think I would say best practices are not part of those conferences. It is limited to the participants and the community facilitators. And so, again, there's a confidentiality agreement to allow for whatever is said in those conferences to be done with the most authenticity that's possible, without individuals being worried about what they share in that space subsequently being used against them in the context of a subsequent prosecution or in some other manner. So that's what I would say to that question. And did you also, Kathleen, want me to talk about the legislation now, or I can loop back to that if we want to have Sandra talk about the legislation part first?
Yeah, would you like to chime in on that, Sandra? And then, yeah, we can come back and see what else there is to share about legislation.
Sure, yeah, I will speak to some of the legislative work that's associated with the policy coalition. So one of the bills that the coalition took the lead on and was able to successfully pass in 2023 was AB 60, which is a survivor's right to be notified of their restorative justice options. And I think that's the one that I wanted to focus on, because I think it's important to name that, it's significant that the bill passed, to begin with. But what I really appreciated about it is that it mentions that folks should have the ability to be notified of their RJ options at a variety of different points in time. And so, you know, as Demaris mentioned, there is RJ that exists that is pre-charged, there's pre-trial restorative justice, there's post-conviction, such as VOD programs. And I think that this is, you know, a big deal for folks, because oftentimes we hear from survivors in particular that say, I had no idea that this was an option, and many, many years have gone by. Or if I had known so long ago, so on and so forth. And so I think that aspect of like it being accessible at multiple times is significant. And it's also something that really needs to be implemented. And so we're in that place of what does it mean to implement AB 60, and are fortunate enough to see interest from our system partners in California. But like many other aspects of system and community relationships, there's an element of power at play here. And so I think that that's also where legislation has been really interesting, is that it's beginning to highlight, in I think a very important way, what are these power dynamics that exist between institutions and restorative justice, and how can they be addressed so that RJ continues to be fully held by community, but that we have healthy partnerships, and we can see something like, you know, steady referrals, and ideally an increase in referrals, which I hope that legislation like AB 60 would demonstrate over time. And then the last piece that I'll mention very briefly, because it's currently parked, was AB 2833, which was the Restorative Justice Integrity Bill. And that bill was really about focusing on what was said in an RJ process not being admissible in court. It was a twist, I would say, on confidentiality, because I know that there's been some confidentiality legislation in other places. But we currently parked that bill for the time being because there were some elements added to it that would essentially like be problematic for practitioners, but also limit access to RJ. And I think that that's something to also just name as really important in legislation as far as considerations go, is when we are doing legislative work on RJ, how are we limiting it? You know, are we broadening access to it? Are we including a multitude of harms and folks with, you know, backgrounds and lived experiences that often get excluded, and at various points as far as referrals go, and in various places? And so yeah, we'll see where that bill goes, but I think it was a move in the right direction that I hope will be revisited. I don't know if Demaris, if you want to add on California, or pass it over to Connor.
Yeah, just briefly, I would add a little bit about the implementation for the legislation. It is, thank you for mentioning, now is sort of in that process of implementing, and what are the levers for making sure that the bill is implemented. What happens if it's not, you know, implemented? I know Tristan mentioned that, or not Tristan, maybe Kathleen, I'm getting confused about who mentioned that even though there's legislation in you all's jurisdiction requiring victims to be notified, often it's not being complied with, and victims are still not being notified. So with AB 60 was signed last October, so signed almost a year ago, effective January of this year. And although not a right to access restorative justice, is actually a right to be notified about restorative justice programs that are available in the area where the crime occurs, and as it includes the local community, the county of residence, county jails, juvenile detention facilities, and CDCR. And it's applicable to all victims of crime, all case types, includes both juvenile and adult cases. And as Sandra mentioned, it's all of these different touch points, including law enforcement agencies, police, sheriff, CHP, the Attorney General's office. And in fact, the Attorney General's office is required to create a updated Marsy's Law notification card that adds this as one of the rights that victims are entitled to in their I believe under Marsy's Law now. And that's required to be available by July 1st of 2025. District attorney's offices also need to be involved in that notification requirement, probation department, CDCR, and parole. So a broad range of system actors who have this obligation to notify victims of restorative justice availability and options. And so I won't go into like how folks are supposed to comply with that. There's a lot of different ways, including that AG's office or other, self-created Marcy's Law notification cards and brochures. However, what is promising is that the California District Attorneys Association is providing training through the association to district attorney offices throughout California of this new law, the intention behind the law, ways to comply with the law. So sure, there's still, offices that can, there's not an enforcement mechanism that I'm aware of, but the fact that there is education that is happening around this is promising because it's bringing this conversation around restorative justice into places that previously it would not likely have landed. And even I will just use my own office as an example of trying to have someone from the same folks who delivered the training on AB 60 from California District Attorneys Association to potentially do a training in our office. Like I could easily do the training myself. However, having the training come from CDCAA, an organization that's historically been fairly conservative, would have a lot more credibility with prosecutors who are more conservative as well, and maybe career prosecutors who have been very critical of things like restorative justice and not thought that it was something that could really be effective. So to have, an organization with a restorative justice community now built into that organization as well, and a advocate who has a very strong background in restorative justice that has received funding on, implementing training and monitoring the effectiveness of some of the restorative justice programming to be delivering this type of education to prosecutors throughout the state of California is some level of progress, I believe.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Damaris and Sandra. And Connor, would you like to share anything about impact of legislation on RJ work in Wyoming?
That's a great question, Wyoming, because I was going through the laws database just to confirm, but there are no specific restorative justice laws in the state of Wyoming. So there's the Wild West portrait of this part of the country, right, that says it's a lawless area, and in terms of restorative justice, it is lawless. We have plenty of other laws, trust me. But so I think that's been our well, one thing I do want to acknowledge is in this panel, right, both the amount of like really immense heart wisdom, but then also like very intelligent, savvy minds navigating some very complex things, which I think is important in doing this work, right, and expanding it. So I just want to honor that, and I'm inspired by y'all. And so we've just have found our focus to be really on those super micro level, right? How can we use some resources to get a legal document between the university and the district to set up a program where we can be a referral agency for restorative justice practices. And so we've worked with, we used the MOU that was a model from the IIRP to model that and have that verified by our general counsel and then the folks downtown to work together to make sure that could all work. So we're starting really hyper local with what that will look like. But I know that when we move forward, that might really need experts with the minds and the big hearts that y'all have to help us move this to get it into a space. But I will say, like, because we're in this only university, the legislature does have their eyes on the University of Wyoming, right? So I'm really trying to say, we're doing this in this micro scale. It does work. We have people from a wide array of backgrounds being inspired and seeing the changes here. And so how can we levy that when the time is right? And I have the resources and the smart people to help with that and move it then on to the state legislature side of things. But yeah, we are lawless here in terms of restorative justice.
Welcome to the Wild West. Thanks so much, Connor. I'm going to keep us going. I'd like to hear some more from Tristan and Javier. Many of you mentioned the importance of restorative justice education for increasing community referrals. What strategies have you found effective for building community trust and engagement to try to generate those community referrals? Tristan, could I pass that one to you?
Yeah, sure. And this kind of actually dovetails with the question about legislation, because I would say one of the most critical pieces of being able to create that trust within the community has come from some of the legislative work that has been done by the Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon. And specifically, I'm talking about confidentiality legislation. So in 2023, RJ Co. Advanced a bill. It's called Senate Bill 586. Now it's got a couple different statutes that correspond to that, that would create, kind of as a general matter, confidentiality for restorative justice programs within the state. And that is from the point of referral to the point at which someone has completed the program. All restorative justice communications are now confidential per state law. So that was really great, in part because it helped with programs that were operating just with district attorneys' offices, that were achieving confidentiality through memorandums of understanding. It shored up protections for those programs because, of course, the only people or the only entities that were bound by that confidentiality agreement were the ones that had agreed. So you can imagine, a third party, an insurance provider that's filing a lawsuit that wouldn't be bound by that agreement. So it shored up those protections, but perhaps most importantly, it created the ability to hold a restorative process without the agreement of a system partner. Of course, it doesn't bind a prosecutor, law enforcement agency from investigating a case or from filing charges. It just prohibits them from being able to reach into the restorative process and use any statements that are made during the restorative process against either party. So being able to talk to community-based organizations and say, hey, we can do this and we can do this in a way that isn't going to put any of the participants at risk has been a huge deal. In terms of, those community collaborations, it's happening in different ways in different parts of the state. Here in Portland, the Restorative Roots Project has been really focusing on outreach and just being really present in the community and trying to listen to the needs and adapt kind of their programming to what they're hearing as a need in the community. Some areas, and I saw actually a question in the chat about homeless day shelter, trying to integrate restorative principles. And this is a little bit adjacent to that, but I've been in conversation with some affordable housing providers around, what would creating a community referral pathway with, some of those housing providers look like. And what I heard is that there's mutual interest in this in order to avoid eviction. Evictions are very expensive for landlords and for housing agencies. And of course, we want to, especially for affordable housing agencies, supportive housing agencies, they want to be able to maintain people in those apartments. And so we're in very, very early conversations around what it might look like to provide restorative justice interventions for instances of harm and the cases that could have been within the criminal system that could be resolved through a restorative process and hopefully avoid participation in the criminal system and also potentially avoid eviction as well. So very early stages, the statute only went into effect about a little over a year ago. And of course, one of the huge tasks in terms of generating excitement and interest in restorative justice is just educating people about the availability of that resource and what that resource is. There's, a lot of, just like a lack of familiarity with restorative justice as a general matter. And so chipping away at that is a big challenge and one that's really necessary. And we've taken the approach of, doing it by interacting with specific community-based organizations in the area.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tristan. And then Javier, I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to talk about community trust and engagement, or there's another question that I think would be really important for folks to hear about, which is what's been important for you in establishing a program without any similar pre-existing model in the state? Like, what are some of the methods that you've used to try to generate that awareness and trust in what you're doing, even though it was fairly new when you got started?
Yeah, well, I say I've been doing restorative justice work for close to 4 decades, but the first 27 years or so, I called it ministry. And it really was bringing that same model of accompaniment, of being in relationship, with people we have at Healing Dialogue in Action. And where we have found success is where we invite policymakers, the decision makers, to come close to the work, to experience it. Because I've always felt that restorative justice, you can't really describe it. It's something that it's an experience that you need to feel. It's like love, right? How do you describe love? You have to experience it. And so we've done things like last year for during National Crime Victims Week, uh, we went to Chino State Prison and we invited 7 mothers who had lost children to murder. And we sat in 7 circles with men who were serving time for murder. And we invited the warden of the institution, captains, lieutenants. And so we were sitting in circles, and it 2 things happened. One, with the staff inside the prison, they were just thanking us that there was an organization working with victims, because the way that they feel inside California, I mean, a common feeling inside California prisons is that these guys, these people are getting all the programs. What about the victims? What about the victims? So there was a lot of gratitude that there was an organization there that also works with survivors. And the other thing that happened, once they start experiencing that vulnerability and they hear the stories, and the people that work there, the warden, the lieutenants, the captains, they were telling stories that they had never told. They were opening up their hearts. They were becoming vulnerable in a circle with men serving time in prison. We had a captain talk about, I've never told this story before, but the reason I got into this line of work is because they killed my ex-brother-in-law 30 years ago, and that I got a divorce, and going into, so the biggest challenge in reforming the system is that they pit us against each other, right? Pick your side. Are you on the side of the perpetrator, or side of the victim? And then, you're on opposites in battle. And restorative justice is really a model that doesn't look at the labels. Restorative justice is an opportunity for victims and survivors to go through a process of healing that the current system doesn't offer, where they get their questions answers, where they get to see if there's any type of change in the person that harmed them. So yeah, bringing folks in close to experience the model is what's been successful for us.
Wonderful. Yeah, that direct experience, there's nothing like it, right? Thanks so
Right.
much, Javier. So we just have a few minutes left. That time went so quickly. But I'd love to hear, just maybe we could do one more round to hear each person's voice about, I think there's some wisdom that you all have to share about building collaborations. So we've talked a lot about getting community involved and community education. And I know from our history in Colorado, there's been so much that's changed over the history around how RJ programs actually support and collaborate with each other. And so if maybe we could try to just take 1 minute each or so to share any insight, advice that you have about how to go about building those collaborations to strengthen our RJ efforts. Could I pass that one to you, Tristan? Would you start? I know Oregon is really a leader in this area.
Yeah. One thing that I've been really proud of in terms of the way that the coalition has operated and the cohort of programs that we are supporting is how we have really tried to resist the scarcity mindset that is so prevalent in nonprofit spaces. And even, when we have been, we all work together to try and, achieve funding. And we have gone through a roller coaster with the legislature, and we've had some losses and we've had some really awesome successes. And it's one of those things where we're all invested in it together. And when the grant dollars have come through, we've had opportunities to, be together in space and talk about how, grant programs can really cause competition. It can create, that scarcity mindset. And how do we create a culture of really investing in that collective success? And to the extent that it's possible, working with each other as we're building out those budgets, as we're creating our applications and trying to make space for everybody to have a piece of the pie, and also to give room for the development of new programs and to foster growth within new programs. And over the last 6 months, we've been inviting, folks who aren't grant funded yet, but who are interested in applying for the grant into the cohort so that they can be a part of that space and really soak up that wisdom, and also put them in a position where they can, get to hopefully be successful in terms of getting some of that grant dollars. The only other thing I'd say is that I think that collaboration is really natural for restorative justice folks. And so even folks across the country, just reaching out and saying, hey, I've heard you've done this thing. Can we talk? Everybody is just trying to build. And I think it's so awesome to connect with folks when we really are, it's a group of people who really understand that your success is my success, and helping each other is just going to forward this movement in really awesome ways.
Thanks so much, Tristan. How about Sandra and Damaris? Will you share a little bit about collaborative efforts in California or Northern Cal?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. I mean, again, I feel like I can just echo what Tristan said. Tristan's actually one of the people, especially with the Policy Coalition, that we turned to and wanted to learn from. So I think that the idea of starting with, has this already been tried out somewhere else and how did it go, rather than trying to sit down and reinvent the wheel over and over again, leads to some really fruitful work when it comes to building coalitions and collaboratives. But I think that the most important thing from my vantage point has been to start in a very similar way that, to the way we start circles. We should know who's in the room, right? Get to know each other, and then establish shared values, establish community agreements. And then also, we've had a lot of success going through participatory strategic planning. So multiple parts of strategic planning done by an entire collective. And the last thing I'll say, just to be succinct, is to move at the speed of relationship, which I know is also very much tied to restorative justice, but especially in our policy work, we've already learned what happens when we move at the speed of the legislative process, or move at the speed of those that have more power than us that are trying to build something. And we've always come back to this place of, no, we have to move at the speed of relationship and the speed of trust, even if that means that we're not going to accomplish what we set out to accomplish this year. It's more about doing it right, not doing it quickly. And I think that goes a very long way in coalition building. I'll pass it to Damaris.
So I would say it's great to connect and have coalitions with folks who are all, we're all traveling in a similar direction in terms of the goals that we want to accomplish, and how do we build on each other's wisdom to do that. And now I feel like it's just as important, if not sometimes more so, to sort of build across differences, to really try to speak into and develop relationships with folks who may not have the same views. As I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of career prosecutors and more conservative individuals who may not be as committed to restorative justice. And how do you try to build relationships and to try to engage with individuals who are not already bought into this idea of restorative justice? How do you sort of speak across the aisle or, on opposite views? And I just think that's so important going forward to address so much of the polarization and the us versus them and the silos that we end up getting sort of caught into when doing some of this work. And I think restorative justice is a great sort of framework and space to be able to hold difference and to be able to engage with individuals when that difference is there and still find where there are commonalities and to go forward building on those things. So I think, that's what I'm hoping will happen with some of the requirements that are bringing more people into this conversation than what historically have been involved in it.
Thank you. How about you out there in the Wild West, Connor? How has it been working somewhat in isolation, but finding those collaborative opportunities?
Yeah, just quickly, just so grateful for RJ community at large, because people are generous with their time and with their wisdom. And I was having a thought or the image, there's always room for one more in the circle, right? We can always like find space to invite more people in and to share that time and space. And I think that's another strong piece of this community is mentorship, like without which I wouldn't be here. So I'm gonna shout out Avery up there in the panel as one of someone who's been helpful for me in mentorship. People like Duke Fisher, places like USD that have set up mentorship programs. Like I have questions and I need answers, and those people have often been there for me. And then I'll lastly shout out the Colorado Coalition for Restorative Justice Practices, who extended their welcome to me up here, a couple miles over the border. And so it's just, I wouldn't know where I would be without the mentorship and just people finding space for one more, even if the alignment is like a little bit or slightly different. So that's just my shout out.
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, thanks for mentioning some of those national opportunities for support networking. And then Javier, will you share some of your thoughts on collaboration, how that's supported your work?
Sure. Because folks have already mentioned about that specific collaboration amongst ourselves. What I find significant also is collaborations with other organizations doing criminal justice reform, not specific to restorative justice, and being that voice at those tables, right? That when you're planning on how to fix the system, on how to change the system, how to make a better system, include everybody in it, because the system doesn't work for anybody. So how will this law impact? Yes, it's going to help the people that are serving time in some way. How will it impact victims and survivors? And can we do something that would benefit both? So that's what I'll mention about collaboratives.
Great. Thank you so much, Javier. I see that we have reached our closing time. I want to apologize to the folks who put a question in the Q&A that I didn't get to. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll pass it over to Avery to close us out.
Kathleen and all the other panelists, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be able to invite you all to speak today. So many things I could say, but I know we are out of time. I will say I just put up a slide. Panelists, you gave me permission to share your contact information. So there it is. I'll also include your contact information in a post-recording email that I typically send out. And then I also wanted to throw some of the resources in, Kathleen, that you mentioned. I also wanted to put in the chat, Damaris, you mentioned Heather giving permission to share her contact information. So I'll include it here. I'll try to include it in the post recording email that goes out as well. And then last thing is, thank you all for joining us. There's a couple things that's happening. We have a twofer this week. We're kicking off officially for the month of November, Restorative Justice Month, with our webinar that's happening this Friday about restorative justice, neurodiversity, and mental health in the criminal legal system. It's going to be an amazing panel like we've had all year, great conversation. Then we'll be having later on in the month a National Restorative Coaching Program webinar that will talk more about the coaching program the National Center offers. And then also we will conclude our webinar series this year with restorative justice and policy. This was a great tee up to further deeper dive into policy and the national landscape, as well with the RJ Laws database. So super excited for that one to round out the year. And we know it's that time of the year for elections. So thank you all again. Please fill out the feedback. A lot of these topics come because of you and you sending us suggested topics. So I really appreciate you. And sorry we went over time, but thank you so much again and take care.